Mall manager throws out Muslim woman, then Clint Eastwood steps in to defend. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The mall buzzed with the usual hum of chatter, footsteps, and the distant jingle of holiday music playing through the speakers. Families bustled from store to store, children tugging on their parents' hands, and teens gathered in clusters near the food court. It was the kind of Saturday afternoon that most people took for granted: ordinary, predictable, comfortable. For Layla, however, nothing about today felt comfortable. She adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward the directory kiosk, trying to locate the store she needed. Her olive hijab was wrapped neatly around her head, her coat perfectly pressed and her posture upright. Years of dealing with curious stares and subtle whispers had taught her how to walk with quiet confidence, even when the world felt unwelcoming. Her younger sister's birthday was coming up, and Layla had promised to find the perfect gift: a silver bracelet she had seen in one of the mall's jewelry shops. She glanced at her phone, checked the time, and mapped her path toward the store. Almost done, she murmured to herself. As she passed the center of the mall, her footsteps slowed when she felt it, that familiar feeling. A pair of eyes burning into her back. She ignored it, keeping her gaze straight ahead. But the feeling didn't go away. She glanced to her right and noticed a man in a navy suit near one of the kiosks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a slicked-back hairstyle that screamed authority. His name tag gleamed: James Riley, mall manager. His gaze was fixed on her, suspicion etched into every line of his face. Layla's stomach tightened, but she looked away, pretending not to notice. She had seen this before: managers or security guards scrutinizing her a little too closely. Usually it passed. They would realize she was just shopping like everyone else and leave her alone. Just keep walking, she told herself. She turned into the jewelry store, her heart still racing, but she tried to shake it off. Inside, the air was quieter, and the sparkling glass cases provided a moment of calm. "Hi," she said to the salesperson behind the counter. "I'm looking for the silver bracelet with the infinity charm. I believe it's in this store?" The woman smiled warmly. "Of course. Let me grab that for you." As Layla waited, she glanced over her shoulder and froze. James Riley stood just outside the store watching her. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression stern, as though he were waiting for something. Layla turned back around, her heart pounding in her chest. What is his problem? She thought. She had done nothing wrong, hadn't even spoken to anyone except the salesperson. The bracelet was placed gently in front of her. "Here it is," the woman said. "Would you like to try it on?" "Yes, please," Layla replied, forcing a polite smile. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, turning it in the light. It was beautiful, delicate and shining, just as she remembered. It was perfect for her sister. "I'll take it," she said quickly, reaching for her wallet. But before the transaction could be completed, a shadow fell across the counter. "Excuse me, miss," a voice said sharply. Layla turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. James Riley stood there, his arms crossed and a disapproving frown on his face. The other shoppers in the store glanced over, sensing the sudden tension. "Yes?" Layla asked, her voice steady but wary. "Can I help you with something?" "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," James said, his tone clipped and professional but with an unmistakable edge. Layla blinked, confusion flooding her features. "I'm sorry, what?" "I need you to come with me," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity, and I need to ask you a few questions." "Suspicious activity?" Layla echoed, her voice rising slightly. "I haven't done anything. I'm just buying a bracelet." The salesperson looked between them, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, is there a problem?" "She's a paying customer." "This doesn't concern you," James snapped at the woman before turning back to Layla. "I'd like you to step outside of the store. Now." Layla felt the heat rising to her cheeks. The shoppers in the store were watching, whispering to one another. She could feel their judgmental stares boring into her, their assumptions hanging heavy in the air. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "I haven't done anything wrong." James's frown deepened. "Miss, if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to call security." "You don't want that, do you?" Layla stared at him, stunned. Her pulse roared in her ears as a wave of disbelief and anger crashed over her. "You're accusing me of something I didn't do," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not accusing you of anything," James said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm simply doing my job. Now step outside." Layla's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to shout at him for the injustice of it all, but she knew it wouldn't help. If she raised her voice, she would look guilty. If she argued, people would take his side. "I'm not going with you," she said through gritted teeth. "If you think I've done something wrong, prove it." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a deep, gravelly voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What seems to be the problem here?" The room fell silent. Heads turned toward the entrance of the store where an older man stood. He wore a worn leather jacket and carried himself with the kind of calm authority that only comes from decades of experience. His silver hair and sharp, weathered features were unmistakable. Clint Eastwood. Layla's jaw dropped slightly, as did a few others in the room. The iconic actor and director looked at the scene unfolding before him, his eyes narrowing as they landed on James Riley. James straightened up, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, Mr. Eastwood," he stammered. "This doesn't concern you?" Clint raised an eyebrow, stepping further into the store. "Sure looks like it does," he said, his voice low and steady. "You've got a young woman here, minding her own business, and you're barking at her like she's a criminal. Seems like a problem to me." James's face flushed, but he tried to maintain his composure. "I'm handling a situation, sir. I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere." Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what situation would that be?" James faltered, glancing at Layla. "We've had reports of suspicious activity, and I'm asking her to cooperate with mall security." Clint looked at Layla, his gaze softening for a moment. "Did you do anything wrong?" he asked her directly. "No," Layla said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I'm just trying to buy a bracelet." Clint nodded once, then turned back to James. "You hear that? She's just buying a bracelet. So unless you've got evidence that she's committed a crime, I suggest you back off." James bristled. "With all due respect, sir, With all due respect," Clint interrupted, his voice calm but cutting, "you're making a scene. A pretty ugly one if you ask me. You're singling her out because of the way she looks. And that's not just unprofessional, it's wrong." The room was deathly quiet now. The other shoppers were frozen in place, their eyes darting between Clint and James. Layla's heart pounded as she watched the confrontation unfold. For the first time since James had approached her, she felt a flicker of hope, of relief. James's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around as though realizing how many people were watching. His confidence seemed to falter under Clint's unflinching gaze. "This is a misunderstanding," James muttered finally, his voice weaker now. Clint stepped closer, his eyes locked on James's. "Then maybe you should apologize," he said quietly. James blinked, clearly taken aback. "Apologize?" Clint's expression hardened. "You embarrassed her in front of all these people. You accused her of something without cause. The least you can do is apologize." Layla held her breath, unable to look away. She had spent years standing up for herself, but this, seeing someone else stand up for her, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. James shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around the store. Finally, he turned to Layla, his face red with embarrassment. I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Clint raised an eyebrow. "Louder." James clenched his jaw but relented. He looked at Layla and said, more clearly this time, "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." Layla stared at him, still stunned, but she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Clint turned back to Layla, his expression softening. "You okay?" "Yes," Layla said, her voice steady. "Thank you." Clint nodded, then looked around the store. "You folks go on about your business," he said. "Show's over." Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, the tension in the room dissipating like smoke. Layla watched as Clint turned and walked toward the exit, his calm authority still lingering in the air. Before he stepped out, he glanced back at her and tipped his head slightly. "Take care, miss." Layla smiled faintly, her heart full. "You too, sir." As he disappeared into the mall, Layla turned back to the counter. The salesperson, still flustered, offered her an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry about that." "It's okay," Layla said, slipping the bracelet back onto her wrist. "I'll take it." The tension lingered in Layla's chest even as she left the jewelry store with the small bag containing her sister's bracelet. The mall seemed quieter now, though she knew it was only her mind tricking her. She felt the weight of invisible stares on her back, the echoes of whispered judgment following her as she walked. Clint Eastwood's intervention had stopped James Riley, but the sting of the encounter hadn't disappeared. Layla had spent years fighting off the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, biases people held against her. She had grown used to enduring it silently. But today something had shifted. she hadn't been alone. Clint's words still echoed in her mind. You're singling her out because of the way she looks. That's not just unprofessional, it's wrong. No one had ever stood up for her like that before. It was surreal. Layla paused by a small bench near the center of the mall, sitting down to gather her thoughts. She looked at the bracelet in her bag, turning it over gently in her hand. Her sister would love it. That thought gave her some comfort. You okay there? The voice made her jump slightly. She looked up and to her surprise, saw Clint Eastwood standing a few feet away, hands tucked casually into his leather jacket pockets. Oh, Layla said, blinking at him. I didn't see you there. Clint walked over, his footsteps deliberate but light. Didn't mean to startle you, he said. I just wanted to check on you before I head out. Layla smiled faintly. I'm okay. Really? Clint tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same calm intensity she had seen earlier. You don't look okay. Layla hesitated, unsure how to respond. For years, she had been conditioned to keep her feelings to herself, to nod and smile and move on. But there was something about Clint's presence that made her want to tell the truth. It's just, she sighed, looking down at the bag in her hands. It's not the first time something like this has happened. I've gotten used to it, I guess. Clint sat down on the bench beside her, his leather jacket creaking slightly. You shouldn't have to get used to it. Layla glanced at him, surprised by the firmness in his voice. People like that mall manager, Clint continued, his tone low and measured, they think they can get away with it because no one calls them out. They've spent years believing their actions don't have consequences. Layla nodded slowly. Yeah, well, calling them out doesn't always help. Most of the time it just makes things worse. Clint turned his head to look at her, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. Not today. Layla smiled faintly. No, not today. For a moment they sat in silence, the hum of the mall fading into the background. Layla couldn't believe she was sitting here, having a conversation with Clint Eastwood of all people. But more than that, she couldn't believe how seen she felt. I don't know why you stepped in, she said finally. But thank you. It means a lot. Clint shrugged, his expression softening slightly. It's the right thing to do. Layla shook her head. Not everyone thinks like that. Maybe not, Clint said. But they should. Layla looked away, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag. I just don't understand people like him, she said quietly. Why does it bother them so much? The way I look, the way I dress, what does it have to do with them? Clint sighed, leaning back on the bench. Fear. Layla frowned, turning to him. Fear? Yeah, Clint said, his voice thoughtful. People like James Riley, people who judge others without knowing them, they're afraid of what they don't understand. It's easier for them to blame someone else than to admit they might be wrong. Takes courage to face your own ignorance. Layla stared at him, letting his words sink in. You're right, she murmured. Clint looked at her, his expression kind but serious. Don't let people like that make you doubt yourself, he said. They're the ones with the problem, not you. Layla smiled, a genuine one this time. I'll try to remember that. Clint nodded once, satisfied. He stood up, adjusting the collar of his jacket. Well, I'd better get going. Take care of yourself, kid. You too, Layla replied, watching as he walked away. For a moment, she just sat there, the weight on her chest feeling lighter than it had in hours. Clint's words stayed with her, wrapping around her like a shield. They're the ones with the problem, not you. Layla stood up, her shoulders back and her chin lifted. She wasn't going to let people like James Riley define her. Not now, not ever. Across the mall, James Riley sat in his office, staring blankly at the pile of paperwork on his desk. The confrontation with Clint Eastwood replayed in his mind on an endless loop. You're singling her out because of the way she looks. That's not just unprofessional, it's wrong. Clint's words had struck a nerve. James had always thought of himself as a fair manager, someone who ran a tight ship and kept things orderly. But today he had seen himself through someone else's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Why had he approached that woman in the first place? Had she really looked suspicious, or had he just assumed? He remembered the way Layla had looked at him, hurt, humiliated, angry. And he remembered the way Clint had looked at him, disappointed, almost disgusted. James let out a long breath, feeling a knot of shame twist in his stomach. He had made a mistake. A big one. And the worst part was he couldn't take it back. A soft knock at the door made him look up. His assistant, Karen, poked her head in. Everything okay, Mr. Riley? James hesitated before answering. Yeah, I'm fine. Karen nodded. Okay. Well, security just sent me the report from earlier. About the woman in the jewelry store? James stiffened. What report? Karen held up a small folder. They checked the cameras and talked to the store staff. There was no suspicious activity. She didn't do anything. James felt his stomach drop. He had known it already deep down, but hearing it out loud made it real. He had accused an innocent woman, embarrassed her in front of strangers, because of his own assumptions. Thanks, Karen, he said quietly. You can leave it on the desk. Karen placed the folder on the corner of his desk and left, closing the door softly behind her. James stared at the folder for a long time before picking it up. He flipped through the report, reading the brief notes from the security team. Everything was there in black and white. Layla hadn't done a thing. He set the folder down, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, James Riley felt like the villain of his own story. The next morning, Layla returned to the mall, not because she wanted to, but because she had to pick up another item for her sister's birthday. She had considered avoiding the place altogether, but she refused to let one bad experience keep her away. As she walked through the entrance, she spotted a familiar figure near the information desk. James Riley stood there, his posture stiff and his expression uncertain. Her first instinct was to walk the other way, but something about his demeanor stopped her. He wasn't the same confident, overbearing manager she had seen yesterday. He looked humbled. "Miss," James said as she approached. His voice was quieter this time, almost hesitant. Layla crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Yes." James cleared his throat, looking her in the eye. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I made an assumption and it wasn't fair. I'm sorry." Layla stared at him, searching for any trace of insincerity. But all she saw was guilt, and maybe a hint of shame. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice even. "I hope you learned something from it." "I did," James said quickly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I regret how I acted." Layla nodded slowly. "Good. You should." James flinched slightly at the bluntness of her words, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside, clearing her path. "Have a good day, miss," he said softly. Layla walked past him without another word, her head held high. As she continued toward the store, she thought about Clint Eastwood and the way he had stood up for her. People like James might never fully understand the harm they caused, but moments like yesterday mattered. They created cracks in the walls people like him had built around their ignorance. And sometimes cracks were all you needed to let the light in. By the time Layla reached the boutique to pick up her sister's second gift, her steps felt lighter. The confrontation with James Riley had left her shaken the day before, but today she felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't just his apology that settled her emotions. It was knowing that someone like Clint Eastwood, someone with so much power, respect, and authority, had chosen to step in, to stand up for her when she needed it most. She wasn't used to that. Usually, people turned their heads the other way. She browsed the shelves of the boutique for a few minutes before selecting a beautifully patterned silk scarf. Her sister loved colorful, artistic pieces, and this one seemed perfect. "Would you like it gift-wrapped?" the clerk asked kindly. "Yes, please," Layla replied, smiling warmly. As the clerk began wrapping the scarf, Layla checked her phone and saw a text from Emily, one of her closest friends. "Emily, how are you feeling? I can't believe what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" Layla's thumb hovered over the keyboard before she typed her reply. "Layla, I'm okay. It was awful, but someone stood up for me, Clint Eastwood, of all people." Emily's reply came almost immediately. "Emily, Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? Are you serious?" Layla couldn't help but smile as she typed. "Layla, yeah. I still can't believe it either." Emily sent a flurry of shocked emojis followed by, "You have to tell me everything later. I'm so glad you're okay." Layla tucked her phone back into her bag, feeling a flicker of warmth. For years, she had grown used to carrying these moments of prejudice alone, rarely talking about them in detail. But today, for once, she didn't feel alone. The clerk handed her the neatly wrapped gift and Layla thanked her, stepping out of the store. She was heading toward the exit, ready to leave the mall for good, when she noticed a small crowd gathering near the center fountain. Curiosity got the better of her and she walked closer. People were murmuring and pointing their phones out as they recorded. At the center of the commotion, she saw none other than Clint Eastwood, standing calmly with his arms crossed as he spoke to a group of teenagers. "The point is, it costs you nothing to be kind," Clint was saying, his gravelly voice carrying over the murmurs. "When you see someone being treated unfairly, don't look away. Say something. Do something." The teenagers nodded, clearly hanging on his every word. One of them, a boy with shaggy brown hair, asked, But what if you get in trouble for standing up to someone? Clint raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Trouble's not always a bad thing, kid. Sometimes trouble's just the price you pay for doing the right thing. The crowd chuckled softly, but the message hit home. Layla could see it in the teenagers' faces. The way they stood a little taller, the way they listened so intently. Clint glanced up then and spotted Layla standing on the edge of the crowd. For a moment, their eyes met, and he gave her a subtle nod as though to say, "You're stronger than you think." Layla smiled, nodding back. She turned to leave the mall, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. She paused for a moment, breathing it in, letting the events of the past 2 days wash over her. Clint Eastwood was right. Standing up for what was right sometimes came at a cost. But it mattered. And Layla promised herself that the next time she saw someone facing the kind of unfairness she had faced, she wouldn't look away. That evening, James Riley sat at his desk long after the mall had closed. The office lights buzzed quietly above him, the emptiness of the building pressing in on all sides. The report Karen had given him sat on his desk, open to the page that spelled out his mistake. His actions had been wrong. There was no spinning it, no justifying it. He had let his assumptions, his biases, dictate his behavior, and he had hurt someone because of it. And Clint Eastwood had seen it. Had called him out in front of everyone. James leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. For years he had seen himself as a good man. A fair manager. He followed the rules, ran a tight operation, and expected the best from his team. But this incident had forced him to see a version of himself he didn't like. A version that acted out of fear and ignorance rather than fairness. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. He picked up the phone and dialed the head of mall security. After a couple of rings, a gruff voice answered, "Yes, Mr. Riley? I want a meeting with the team tomorrow morning," James said firmly. "You, the store managers, and the security staff. We need to go over some new policies." "New policies?" "Yes," James replied, his voice steady. "It's time we do better. This kind of mistake can't happen again." The voice on the other end hesitated before replying, "Understood, sir. I'll set it up." James hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, his gaze falling on the folder again. He didn't expect forgiveness from Layla. He wasn't sure he deserved it. But he could change. He could learn. And maybe, just maybe, he could become the kind of leader he thought he was. The next morning, Layla received an unexpected email. Subject: Apology and Next Steps. Dear Ms. Rahman, I want to formally apologize for the way you were treated at Westfield Mall yesterday. My actions were unprofessional and based on unfair assumptions, and for that, I am truly sorry. I am taking immediate steps to ensure this kind of incident does not happen again, including staff training and new protocols to prevent discrimination in any form. If you are open to it, I would like to meet with you to discuss your experience and hear any suggestions you may have for how we can improve. I understand if you do not wish to respond, but please know that I am committed to making this right. Sincerely, James Riley, Mall Manager. Layla stared at the email, her emotions a mix of surprise and disbelief. She hadn't expected this, not from him. Apologies like this were rare, especially from people in positions of authority. She considered ignoring it. After all, what good would a meeting do? But then she remembered Clint Eastwood's words, "Sometimes trouble's just the price you pay for doing the right thing." Layla thought for a moment longer, then began typing a reply. A week later, Layla found herself sitting in a conference room at Westfield Mall. Across the table sat James Riley, looking far less intimidating than he had that day in the jewelry store. His shoulders were slightly slumped, his expression serious but not unkind. "Thank you for coming," James said, his voice quiet but sincere. Layla nodded. "I wasn't sure I would, but I thought it might help." James folded his hands on the table. "I want to start by saying that I'm sorry. Not just for how I treated you but for how my actions affected you. I've spent the past week thinking about it, and I realize now how wrong I was." Layla studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "What changed?" James sighed. "You, Clint Eastwood, that whole day forced me to take a hard look at myself. I realized I'd been letting my assumptions control me. I didn't see you, I saw what I thought you were. And that's not fair to you or anyone else." Layla nodded slowly, her expression softening. "What are you going to do about it?" James straightened up slightly. "We're implementing anti-discrimination training for all mall employees, including security staff. I'm also working with an outside consultant to create policies that ensure incidents like this don't happen again." Layla raised an eyebrow. "Policies are a good start. But change takes more than that." James met her gaze. "I know. I'm working on it. For a long moment they sat in silence. Finally Layla said, I appreciate the apology. And I appreciate that you're trying to do better. James nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Thank you. As Layla stood to leave, James said, one more thing. She turned back. I want you to know, you didn't deserve what happened that day. You deserve respect. And I'm sorry I didn't give you that. Layla smiled faintly. Thank you for saying that. She walked out of the conference room feeling lighter than she had in days. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was a start. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, she thought of Clint Eastwood and the way he had stood up for her. His words would stay with her, a reminder that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. The week after her meeting with James Riley, Layla felt a shift, not just in herself but in how she approached the world. She had always believed that change was slow, often impossible, but seeing a man like James confront his own biases gave her hope. People could change. People could learn. It didn't erase what had happened, but it made it easier to move forward. Her sister's birthday was that Saturday, and as Layla stepped into her parents' home carrying a box of pastries and the gift bag containing the bracelet and scarf, she was greeted with the usual warmth. Layla, her mother called from the kitchen. You're just in time. Your sister's been asking for you all morning. Layla smiled and kicked off her shoes, moving toward the dining room where the family had gathered. Her sister, Nadia, was sitting at the head of the table, a crown made of paper perched crookedly on her head. There you are, Nadia said, grinning widely. I was starting to think you forgot about me. Never, Layla said, handing her the gift bag. Happy birthday, troublemaker. Nadia opened the bag eagerly, pulling out the bracelet first. Oh my gosh, she gasped, her fingers gently touching the infinity charm. Layla, this is beautiful. Turn it over, Layla said softly. Nadia turned the bracelet in her hands, and her eyes widened as she saw the small engraving on the back, Forever Sisters. Tears glistened in her eyes. I love it, she whispered. Open the next one, Layla urged, a grin tugging at her lips. Nadia pulled out the scarf, her face lighting up at the colorful patterns. It's perfect. You always pick the best gifts. She stood up and wrapped her arms around Layla in a tight hug. Thank you. You're the best sister ever. Layla hugged her back, her heart full. Her mother watched them with a soft smile. You two are like night and day, but you're so close. Forever sisters, Nadia said with a grin, holding up the bracelet. Layla smiled, but her mind briefly flashed back to that day at the mall, how something as simple as buying this bracelet had turned into an ordeal. Yet here, surrounded by her family, the memory felt distant, like a storm cloud that had finally passed. A few days later, Layla returned to the mall, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She wanted to prove to herself that she wouldn't let one incident keep her away. The mall was just as busy as before, families bustling through the halls and the hum of activity filling the air. Layla walked past the jewelry store, glancing inside briefly before continuing on her way. As she rounded the corner, she spotted a familiar figure standing near the central fountain. Clint Eastwood. He was leaning casually against the railing, his hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket as he looked out over the mall with that same calm authority. For a moment, Layla hesitated. What could she say to him? How could she possibly thank him for what he had done? Finally, she took a deep breath and approached him. Mr. Eastwood? Clint turned his head, a faint smile appearing as he saw her. Well, look who it is, he said, his gravelly voice warm. How are you, kid? Layla smiled, feeling some of the nervousness ease. I'm good. I wanted to thank you again. For what you did. Clint shrugged, his expression easy. You don't have to thank me. No, I do, Layla insisted. Most people wouldn't have stepped in like that. You didn't have to, but you did. And it made a difference. Clint looked at her for a long moment, his gaze softening. Sometimes all it takes is one person to say, this isn't right. You don't need to be a hero, you just need to show up. Layla nodded, letting his words sink in. I'm trying to remember that, she said. Clint smiled faintly. Good. The world needs more people like you, Layla. Her eyes widened slightly. You know my name? Of course I do, Clint replied, a twinkle of amusement in his eye. I asked around. You left an impression. Layla laughed softly, shaking her head. Well, you left an impression too. Clint chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. I tend to do that. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as shoppers moved around the mall, completely unaware of the quiet moment unfolding by the fountain. Do you think people really change? Layla asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Clint looked at her thoughtfully. I think some people can, he said. If they're willing to face the truth about themselves, and if they're willing to do the work to change. But it's not easy. Most people don't like admitting they were wrong. Layla nodded slowly, his words resonating with her. James Riley apologized, she said quietly. And he said he's changing things at the mall, new policies, training for staff. I hope he means it. Clint raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. Well, that's a start. You held him accountable, whether you realize it or not. I guess so, Layla murmured. I want things to be better. For people like me? Clint nodded, his expression serious. Keep doing what you're doing, kid. Speak up when it matters. The more people like you who stand tall, the harder it is for the world to look the other way. Layla smiled, his words filling her with a sense of quiet strength. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. Clint gave her a small nod. Anytime. And call me Clint. Okay. Clint, Layla said, grinning. Clint turned, his leather jacket creaking as he began walking away. But before he disappeared into the crowd, he glanced back at her one last time. Take care, Layla, he said. And remember, don't let anyone make you feel small. I won't, Layla replied, her voice steady. As he walked off, Layla stood there for a moment, feeling lighter than she had in days. Clint was right. She wouldn't let anyone make her feel small. Not anymore. Months later, Layla sat at her desk in her small office, staring at the email she had just received. It was from James Riley, though this time it wasn't an apology. Subject: Update on new policies. Dear Ms. Rahman, I wanted to personally thank you for your role in helping us make Westfield Mall a better place. Since implementing the new anti-discrimination training and policies, we've seen a significant improvement in how our staff interacts with customers. I've also received positive feedback from team members who feel more aware and better equipped to handle diverse situations. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. I hope this is just the beginning. Sincerely, James Riley, Mall Manager. Layla leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, but reading his email gave her hope. Maybe people really could change. Maybe it wasn't as impossible as she had once thought. She clicked out of the email and opened her browser, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. After a moment, she began typing. How to organize community workshops on discrimination awareness. If Clint Eastwood had taught her anything, it was that standing up for what was right didn't stop with one moment. It was a continuous effort, one that took courage, persistence, and a refusal to back down. Layla smiled as she clicked on the first search result. It was time to do her part. Layla leaned back in her chair, staring at James Riley's email one more time. The words, change isn't easy, but it's necessary, lingered in her mind, echoing through her thoughts. A small smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't often that people like James owned up to their mistakes and took action. But as encouraging as this progress was, Layla knew it was just the beginning. Her encounter with Clint Eastwood and James had planted a seed, one that could grow if nurtured. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. And if James Riley, a man set in his ways, could learn, then others could too. Layla turned her attention back to the browser she had opened earlier. She scrolled through articles about organizing community workshops, outreach programs, and anti-discrimination training. As a freelance community organizer, Layla had always been passionate about building bridges and encouraging understanding, but recent events had pushed her to take things further. Time to act, she murmured to herself. Over the next week, Layla dove headfirst into planning. She reached out to local community leaders, religious organizations, and educators to form a small coalition. Together, they brainstormed ideas for a series of workshops and events aimed at addressing bias and promoting inclusivity. Layla's vision was simple: to create a space where people could learn, reflect, and grow. She wanted to engage young people, businesses, and local leaders, all the groups that could have a direct impact on the community. The event was held at a local library, in a large community hall with tall windows that let in plenty of natural light. Banners hung along the walls, bearing messages of unity, understanding, and respect. Tables were set up with informational pamphlets, volunteer sign-up sheets, and resources for attendees who wanted to take further action. Layla stood at the front of the room, wearing a soft blue hijab that matched the calm confidence she felt inside. The room was bustling with energy. More people had shown up than she had expected. Young students, families, small business owners, and even a few local politicians mingled with one another, chatting and exploring the displays. She spotted her sister Nadia sitting with their parents near the front row. Nadia gave her a thumbs up, grinning brightly, and Layla felt a swell of pride and gratitude. Her family had always supported her dreams, and today was no exception. As the crowd began to settle, Layla stepped up to the microphone. She took a deep breath and smiled. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you so much for being here today. Your presence means more than you know." The room quieted, all eyes turning to her. "Today is about conversation," Layla continued. "It's about asking questions, learning from each other, and recognizing the biases we all carry. None of us are perfect, but we can all strive to do better. And sometimes doing better starts with a single step, like showing up here today." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I started this initiative because of an experience I had not too long ago. I was unfairly judged for the way I look, for the way I choose to present myself to the world. Unfortunately, that's not a unique experience. It's something that happens every day to people in this community, whether we realize it or not." The audience nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. "But I also learned something important that day," Layla said. "I learned that people can change. That accountability matters. That speaking up matters. And that standing up for someone, even a stranger, can make all the difference." She glanced toward the back of the room where Clint Eastwood stood, arms crossed, watching her with a faint smile. His presence had been an unexpected surprise. Layla had sent him an invitation, never expecting he'd show up. But there he was, as steady and unshakable as ever. "So today," Layla continued, "I challenge all of you to think about what you can do to stand up for others. To ask questions when you don't understand something instead of making assumptions. To show up for people in your life, and in your community, who need your support. Because real change doesn't come from speeches or policies alone. It comes from people like us in rooms like this making the choice to do better." The room erupted into applause. Layla smiled, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone here, about the small steps they could take together to create a stronger, kinder community. As people filtered out of the room, many stopped to shake Layla's hand, thanking her for organizing the event. Local business owners asked about hosting workshops in their workplaces, while teachers inquired about bringing similar programs into their schools. Clint Eastwood approached her as the room began to empty, his leather jacket slung casually over one shoulder. "You've got a real gift for this," he said, his voice low and steady. Layla smiled. "Thank you. I'm just trying to follow your example." Clint chuckled softly. "You don't need my example, you've got it figured out. All I did was show up that day. You're the one turning it into something bigger." Layla looked at him, her expression earnest. "But you did show up. And that mattered more than you know." Clint tilted his head slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "Well, you're showing up now. And you're getting others to do the same. That's what matters." Layla nodded, her heart full. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already has," Clint replied. "Keep going. Don't let anyone stop you." He extended his hand and Layla shook it firmly. "Thank you, Clint. For everything." "Anytime," he said with a faint smile. "Take care of yourself, kid." As Clint walked toward the door, Layla watched him go, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had been right all along. Sometimes standing up for what's right came at a price. But it was always worth it. James Riley sat in the front row of a small conference room, listening as one of Layla's workshop facilitators spoke to a group of business owners about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. His posture was straight, his gaze focused, and he listened intently to every word. After the session ended, James approached Layla, who had been observing quietly from the back of the room. "This was really good," he said, shaking her hand. "Better than I expected." Layla smiled faintly. "Thank you. It's a process, but I think we're getting there." James nodded, his expression serious. "I wanted to tell you. I've started holding monthly meetings with my team to review our policies. I've also been working with a consultant to help us continue improving." "That's great," Layla said sincerely. "Real change takes time, but you're doing the work. That matters." James hesitated, then added, "I'm not the same person I was that day. I'm trying to be better. I just wanted you to know that." Layla studied him for a moment before nodding. "I believe you." As James walked away, Layla felt a sense of closure settle over her. The road had been difficult, but it had led to something meaningful. One evening, Layla sat at her desk, scrolling through photos from her most recent workshop. Smiling faces filled the screen. Students, parents, teachers, and leaders who had come together to learn and grow. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the message. "Clint, keep going, kid. You're doing good work. Proud of you." Layla smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Layla, thanks Clint. I couldn't have done it without you. As she set her phone down, Layla looked out her window at the city skyline. The world wasn't perfect and it never would be. But she had learned that change started with one person, one voice, one moment of courage. And sometimes all it took was someone showing up when it mattered most. Layla leaned back in her chair, a quiet smile on her face. She was ready for whatever came next.